On May 24, 1944, Baker Company lay pinned to the ground on an open field south of Cisterna. Above them, German machine guns howled savagely, tearing through grass and air, cutting off all routes of retreat. Sergeant Antolak knew the enemy would soon cut down his men one by one. 3 bullets were lodged in his body, and his right arm hung limp. He summoned every ounce of will. With his good hand, now weakened and unresponsive, he pulled the Thompson close and began to rise. What had brought him to this killing field had begun 4 months earlier in the suffocating mud of the beachhead. I poured everything into this story. Every emotion, every twist, every moment. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Get comfortable and let's dive deep. The dawn came reluctantly over the Anzio beachhead, a pale wash of gray that did little to soften the scarred landscape. Sergeant Sylvester Antolak stood at the forward edge of Company B's position, his boots planted in mud that never quite dried, never quite froze, just persisted in its cloying grip like everything else about this miserable stretch of Italian coast. Behind him, in the warren of trenches and dugouts that had become home since late January, his men were stirring, those who had managed sleep despite the mosquitoes and the sporadic crack of sniper fire. 4 months. 4 months since the Third Infantry Division had splashed ashore at Nettuno as part of Operation Shingle, expecting a quick dash to Rome. 4 months since that expectation had died in the mud and wire and carefully prepared German defenses. The beachhead that was supposed to be a triumph had become a prison, 10 miles deep and 15 wide, hemmed in by German artillery positions in the Alban Hills that could see everything, hit anything. Sylvester, Syl to the men who'd survived long enough to earn the familiarity, was 37 years old, ancient by infantry standards. He'd been born in Fairpoint, Ohio, son of Polish immigrants who'd crossed an ocean seeking something better than the old country offered. He'd found it too, enough to make him walk into the recruiting office in his hometown of St. Clairsville on a July morning in 1941. 4 months before Pearl Harbor made the decision for millions of others. The peacetime army had seemed like steady work, a chance to serve the country that had given his family a new start. Now he commanded a squad in the 1st Battalion, 15th Infantry Regiment. He'd earned his stripes in Sicily, at Salerno, in the grinding push up the Italian boot. Each battle had filed away a bit more of whatever it was that made a man soft, left him harder and more competent, and somehow both more and less human. The men looked to him not because he was the oldest, though he was, but because he'd kept more of them alive than any other squad leader in the company. The landscape before him was flat as a griddle, the drained Pontine marshes that Mussolini had turned to farmland in better times. Now it was no man's land, crisscrossed with wire and sown thick with mines, overlooked by German positions that could kill you from 1,000 yards if you were careless. The regiment had learned that lesson in blood. Twice already in February, the Germans had counterattacked, trying to drive the beachhead into the sea. Both times they'd been stopped, but the cost had been paid in the bodies stacked like cordwood on the carts that rolled past the reinforcements coming up. Behind Company B's position, the wreckage of Cisterna di Littoria squatted on the horizon, a broken-toothed reminder of the disaster in late January. The Rangers, Darby's Rangers, the best light infantry in the army, had tried to take the town. Out of 767 men, 6 had made it back. The rest were dead or captured, swallowed by a German defense that had been waiting, ready, lethal. Sylvester had known some of those Rangers. Good men, the kind who didn't deserve to die in a trap. Axis Sally knew it too. Her broadcasts from Rome, crackling over captured radios, called Anzio the world's largest self-supporting prisoner of war camp. The men laughed bitterly at that, because she wasn't entirely wrong. You could walk the perimeter in an afternoon if you were suicidal. German artillery, especially the railroad guns the men called Anzio, could reach any point on the beachhead. The morning routine was coffee, sea rations, and the lottery of shells walking across your sector. If your number came up, you died. If it didn't, you waited for tomorrow's draw. The casualties reflected it. The 3rd Division had bled 11,000 men since January. 1,000 killed, 4,000 wounded, 900 missing, and another 6,000 lost to disease and exhaustion. Malaria from the mosquitoes, trench foot from the standing water, shell shock from the unending drumbeat of artillery. Whole companies had been reduced to platoon strength, reformed with green replacements who learned fast or died faster. Sylvester's squad had started with 12 men. 4 were originals. The rest were replacements, some still learning the deadly geometry of fields of fire and covered approaches. He'd made it his business to teach them, not gently, there was no time for gentle, but thoroughly. Better they fear his tongue lashing than learn their lessons from German bullets. The sun climbed higher, revealing the morning's usual tableau. Smoke from cooking fires, quickly doused before German observers could call in fire. The glint of binoculars from the observation posts. The occasional snap of a rifle as some optimistic sniper took a shot at movement. This was the rhythm of Anzio. Long stretches of grinding misery punctuated by sudden violence. The kind that left men dead in their holes with surprised expressions. But something was different this morning. Sylvester could feel it in the way the officers moved, the hushed conferences at battalion headquarters, the increased activity among the artillery batteries to the rear. The beachhead was stirring, waking from its long nightmare of stalemate. Runners had been coming and going since before dawn, and the regimental commander, Colonel Richard Thomas, had called a meeting of company officers. Word filtered down through the chain of command by mid-morning. Operation Buffalo, a breakout. After 4 months of siege, the 6th Corps was going over the top, driving for Highway 7 and the Alban Hills, trying to link up with the 5th Army pushing north from the Gustav Line. The 3rd Division would have the right flank, aiming to envelop Cisterna from the south. The 15th Regiment would be in the thick of it. Sylvester received his briefing from Lieutenant Morrison, a competent young officer from Pennsylvania who'd learned to listen to his sergeants. The company would jump off after the artillery preparation, moving fast across open ground to seize German strongpoints before they could organize resistance. Speed was everything. Hesitation meant death. "Any questions, Sergeant?" Morrison asked. Sylvester looked at the map, at the neat arrows showing their axis of advance, at the objective markers that didn't show the machine gun nests and minefields and desperate men who would contest every yard. He thought about his squad, about the kids who still wrote letters home, talking about seeing Rome, about the veterans who knew better but kept fighting anyway. "No questions, sir. We'll be ready." That night, Sylvester checked his Thompson submachine gun for the 100th time, made sure each man in his squad had ammunition and grenades, said a quiet prayer for the first time in weeks. Around him, the beachhead settled into an uneasy quiet, the kind that came before the storm. Tomorrow they would break out or die trying. After 4 months in this hell, either outcome seemed like progress. The 23rd of May arrived with the kind of false promise that comes before a storm. Sylvester woke in the pre-dawn darkness to find his hands already steady, his mind already calculating. 4 hours until H-hour. 4 hours until 1,500 guns opened up on the German positions and turned the world into thunder. Around him, Company B stirred in the controlled chaos of final preparations. Men checked weapons with the ritualistic precision of soldiers who understood that a jammed bolt or a fouled firing pin could mean the difference between walking back and being carried. Private Kowalski, a nervous kid from Detroit who'd arrived as a replacement in March, was field stripping his Garand for the third time in an hour. Sylvester let him be. Better busy hands than idle thoughts. The briefing came at 0400 in a dugout that stank of earth and stale tobacco. Lieutenant Morrison spread the map across a makeshift table constructed from ammunition crates, his flashlight casting shadows that danced across the contour lines and objective markers. Major Pollock, the battalion operations officer, stood beside him, his face carved into hard lines by months on the beachhead. "Gentlemen," Morrison began, his voice carrying the forced steadiness of a young officer trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. "This is it. Operation Buffalo kicks off at 0545 with a 45-minute artillery preparation. 1,500 guns, everything from 105s to the big 155s. The Krauts won't know what hit them." Sylvester studied the map. The 15th Regiment would advance on the right flank, sweeping south and east of Cisterna, while the 7th Regiment took the town head-on, and the 30th held the left. The arrows looked clean on paper. Reality would be messier. It always was. "Our objective," Morrison continued, tapping the map, "is this series of strongpoints east of the Cisterna Canal. Intelligence estimates 4 battalions forward, 3 in reserve. Mostly the 955 Regiment of the 362 Division, with elements of the 715 Division in support. They've had 4 months to dig in, so expect wire, mines, and interlocking fields of fire." "Any armor support, sir?" asked Sergeant Brennan from 1st Squad. "Mediums and lights from the 751 Tank Battalion, plus a section from the 601 Tank Destroyer Battalion. Combat engineers, mortars, machine guns. Major Pollock has put together a proper task force. But the ground is flat and open. We'll be exposed from the moment we jump off." Exposed. The word hung in the dugout like smoke. Every man there had seen what German machine guns could do to infantry crossing open ground. The MG-42. The Krauts called it the bone saw, and you could hear why when it opened up. 1,200 rounds a minute, a sound like ripping canvas, like the sky itself tearing apart. One gun crew could pin down a platoon if they knew their business, and the Germans always knew their business. "Speed is everything," Morrison said. "We hit them hard, we hit them fast, and we don't give them time to reorganize. Questions?" There were always questions, but the men who'd been on the beachhead since January had learned that most answers didn't matter. You went where you were told, did what you were trained to do, and hoped your luck held. Sylvester asked about rally points and casualty evacuation routes because his squad needed to know where to go if things went sideways. When things went sideways. After the briefing, Sylvester gathered his squad in their fighting position. 10 men looked back at him, their faces showing various stages of fear, determination, and the hollow-eyed exhaustion that came from 4 months of siege warfare. Kowalski was there, still fidgeting with his rifle. Corporal Martinez, solid and unflappable, a veteran of Sicily who'd earned his 2nd stripe at Salerno. Private First Class Johnson, the squad's bar man, who could strip and reassemble his Browning automatic rifle blindfolded. The others, a mix of replacements and survivors, each carrying their own weight of expectation and dread. "Listen up," Sylvester said, keeping his voice level and matter-of-fact. "You heard the lieutenant. This is the breakout we've been waiting for. 4 months on this goddamned beach, and tomorrow we're going home through Cisterna and up to Rome." Someone, he thought it was Private Edwards, laughed bitterly at that. Home was an ocean and half a continent away. But Sylvester understood the sentiment. Anywhere was better than Anzio. "We're going to move fast and stay together. When we hit resistance, we suppress and maneuver. Martinez, you take the fire team right. Johnson, you give us covering fire with that bar. Kowalski, you stick with me." The Polish kid nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing. Sylvester wanted to tell him it would be all right, that they'd all make it through. But he'd learned to stop making promises he couldn't keep. Instead, he checked each man's ammunition load, made sure they had grenades, verified that canteens were full and gas masks were accessible. The small rituals of command that kept men focused on the immediate and tangible, rather than the vast and terrifying. The hours crawled past with the peculiar elasticity of time before combat. Some men wrote letters they might never send. Others cleaned weapons that were already spotless. Martinez led a quiet rosary in Spanish, his fingers working worn beads while his lips moved in silent prayer. Sylvester had never been particularly religious, but he didn't begrudge men their faith. Sometimes faith was all that got you through. At 0500, they moved to the jump-off positions. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, a gradual dissolution of darkness that revealed the landscape they would soon cross. Flat, coverless, a killing ground that the Germans had been studying for months, measuring ranges, registering fire missions, preparing the kind of reception that turned brave men into statistics. Sylvester checked his Thompson one last time. The submachine gun was a brute of a weapon, heavy and loud, but at close range it could turn the tide of a firefight. He'd loaded a 30-round magazine, had 4 more in his pouches. 150 rounds of .45 caliber insurance against whatever the day brought. Beside him, Kowalski was breathing too fast, the kind of hyperventilation that could lead to panic. Sylvester put a hand on the kid's shoulder, squeezed once. "Easy, son. Keep your head down, watch your sectors, and follow Martinez. You'll be fine." The lie came easily after so many repetitions. Some of them wouldn't be fine. Some of them would be dead before noon, torn apart by bullets or shrapnel or the simple mathematics of modern war. But you couldn't think about that. You focused on the next minute, the next yard, the next breath. At 0540, Lieutenant Morrison appeared along the line, checking positions, offering words of encouragement that were probably as hollow as Sylvester's own. But the effort mattered. Men needed to see their officers steady, needed to believe that someone understood the plan, even if the plan would dissolve the moment they made contact. Then, at 0545 exactly, the world ended. 1,500 guns spoke as one, a hammer blow of sound that made the air itself shudder. The German positions east of Cisterna disappeared behind a curtain of smoke and fire, as shells rained down at a rate that beggared imagination. High explosive and white phosphorus. Airburst and delayed fuses. A 45-minute symphony of destruction designed to shatter German defenses before the 1st Infantryman crossed the line of departure. Sylvester watched the bombardment with professional appreciation and private skepticism. Artillery could suppress and demoralize, but it rarely killed as many as you hoped. Somewhere in those positions, German soldiers were huddled in their bunkers and fighting holes, enduring the storm, waiting for it to end so they could man their weapons and exact the price for every yard of ground. The barrage lifted at 0630, replaced by the rumble of aircraft as bombers made their runs. Then the artillery resumed, walking forward as the infantry and armor prepared to advance. At 0645, Lieutenant Morrison's whistle shrilled above the thunder. "First platoon, let's go!" Sylvester took a breath, then rose from the trench and stepped into the maelstrom. The first 100 yards were a dream of violence held at arm's length. Sylvester moved in a crouch. Thompson held at port arms, eyes scanning the smoke-shrouded landscape ahead. Around him, Company B advanced in a ragged line. Platoons staggered to avoid presenting a concentrated target. The artillery had done its work. Craters pocked the earth, wire lay twisted and shredded, and fires still burned in what had been German forward positions. Then, the dream ended. The MG-42 opened up from somewhere ahead and to the right, its distinctive ripping canvas sound unmistakable even in the chaos. Tracers arced across the flat ground at knee height, a grass-cutting pattern designed to catch men in the legs and groin and gut. Private Edwards went down without a sound, simply folded in half and dropped. Someone screamed. Sylvester hit the dirt behind a low rise that offered concealment if not cover, his mind already processing angles and distances. Contact right, 200 yards. Martinez's voice, steady despite the maelstrom. The corporal had gone to ground 20 yards away, his rifle already seeking targets. More machine guns joined the first, a chorus of bone saws working in concert. The Germans had waited until Company B was committed, fully exposed on the open ground, before revealing their positions. Professional, deadly, exactly what Sylvester had expected but hoped wouldn't happen. A Sherman tank rumbled past, its 30-ton bulk drawing fire like a magnet. The turret traversed, the 75mm gun barked once, and one of the German positions disappeared in a geyser of earth and smoke. But there were more, always more. The Krauts had spent 4 months preparing these defenses, and they weren't giving them up cheaply. First squad, on me. Second squad, suppress that position. Lieutenant Morrison was up and moving, his carbine firing in short, controlled bursts. Whatever else you could say about the young officer, he had guts. Sylvester pushed to his feet and ran, covering the ground in lunging strides while bullets whipped past with sounds like angry hornets. The squad coalesced around him. Martinez, Johnson with his BAR, Kowalski white-faced but moving. 3 others whose names he catalogued automatically even as his brain calculated fields of fire and covered approaches. They'd reached a shallow irrigation ditch, ancient and half-filled with debris. But it was something. Johnson set up the bar and began hammering out bursts, the big automatic rifle bucking against his shoulder as he walked fire across the German positions. Kowalski grenades. Martinez, get that rifle working. Sylvester's voice cut through the noise, the tone of command that brooked no hesitation. Men moved because moving was better than thinking, better than freezing, better than dying without fighting back. The landscape had transformed into something from nightmare. Smoke obscured vision beyond 50 yards. The air stank of cordite and burnt powder and something sweet and terrible that Sylvester recognized as blood and torn flesh. Explosions walked across the battlefield as German mortars found their range, adding to the chaos. A man from 3rd Squad stumbled past, clutching his arm where shrapnel had opened it to the bone. Another Sherman brewed up, hit by something heavy, probably an 88. The crew bailed out, 3 men running while a 4th burned in the turret, his screams mercifully brief. The tank cooked off, ammunition exploding in a secondary blast that sent the turret pinwheeling through the air. Sylvester marked it automatically. Disabled vehicle, potential cover if they needed to fall back. But they weren't falling back. The momentum was forward, always forward. To stop was to die. The German positions had to be taken, cleared, neutralized. That was the mission. That was survival. Moving. Martinez broke from cover, zigzagging across 20 yards of open ground to a shell crater. Sylvester counted 3 seconds, then followed, his legs pumping while his mind screamed at him that this was insane, that no one could cross this killing ground and live. But he made it, tumbling into the crater beside Martinez while bullets cracked overhead. The corporal was grinning, that feral expression men got when the adrenaline took hold, and fear transformed into something sharper, cleaner. Just like Sicily, Sarge. Sicily had cover, Sylvester gasped. But he was grinning too. The mad exhilaration of being alive when by all rights he should be dead. He risked a look over the crater's lip. The German position was closer now, maybe 150 yards. He could see the bunker's firing slit, the muzzle flash of the MG-42 as it traversed, seeking targets. Johnson had displaced, setting up the bar in a new position and pouring fire into the German strongpoint. The 20-round magazine emptied fast at the weapon's cyclic rate. But Johnson was good, changing magazines with practiced efficiency while maintaining a steady rhythm. Suppression, making the Krauts keep their heads down while the riflemen maneuvered. More men from 1st Platoon were up and moving now, bounding forward in pairs and fire teams, using whatever cover the cratered landscape offered. The doctrine they drilled endlessly at training camps in the States, refined in the crucible of Sicily and Salerno and the long, bloody grind up Italy. Fire and movement, suppress and maneuver, close with and destroy the enemy. Sylvester saw Lieutenant Morrison go down, hit in the leg. The young officer kept crawling forward, dragging himself toward cover while maintaining fire discipline, not wasting ammunition on wild shots. Good. He'd make it or he wouldn't. But he wasn't going to get anyone else killed by panicking. The German machine gun shifted fire, stitching a line of geysers across the ground where Kowalski and 2 others were advancing. The Polish kid threw himself flat, hugging the earth like a lover. One of the others didn't make it, caught mid-stride and spun around by the impact of multiple rounds. He fell in a boneless sprawl that spoke of instant death. Rage kindled in Sylvester's chest, cold and clarifying. These were his men, his responsibility. The Germans were good soldiers doing their duty, but right now they were the enemy, and they were killing his people, and that could not stand. "Martinez, work left. I'm going right." He didn't wait for acknowledgement, just moved, using the smoke and broken ground to mask his approach. The Thompson was heavy in his hands, reassuring weight, 30 rounds of .45 caliber persuasion. At close range, this weapon turned firefights into slaughter. He just had to get close enough. 50 yards now. The bunker was concrete and earth, a professional fortification that would shrug off anything short of a direct hit from a .75. But the fighting aperture was a weakness, a necessary compromise between protection and fields of fire. Sylvester had seen Rangers take bunkers in Sicily by shooting through those slits, clearing the interior with grenades and point-blank fire. 40 yards. A German potato masher grenade sailed out of the position, tumbling end over end before detonating with a sharp crack. Shrapnel whined past, but Sylvester was already moving, reading the throw, understanding the gunner's panic as American infantry closed the distance. 30 yards. He could hear the MG-42 clearly now, its manic rate of fire as the crew traversed, seeking targets. Could hear German voices shouting in that harsh, guttural language, commands and warnings. The bunker was trying to reorient, realizing too late that the main threat wasn't the distant rifleman, but the sergeant closing on their position with murder in his eyes. 20 yards. The machine gun swung toward him, and Sylvester threw himself down as tracers ripped overhead, so close he felt the heat. Rolled left, came up running at an angle. Fire erupted from his Thompson, short bursts that walked up the bunker's face. Not penetrating, not at this range, but making them flinch, making them nervous. 15 yards. Martinez appeared on the left flank, his Garand cracking steadily as he pumped rounds through the firing slit. One of the German crew must have been hit because the machine gun's fire slackened, became erratic. 10 yards. Sylvester pulled a grenade from his harness, yanked the pin, let the spoon fly. Counted 1001, 1002, then hurled it overhand at the bunker's aperture. The throw was good. The grenade bounced once and tumbled into the firing slit. He was already flat when it detonated, the blast channeled by the bunker's interior into lethal effect. Screams. Brief and horrible. Then silence except for the ringing in his ears. Sylvester was up and moving before the smoke cleared. Thompson ready, finger on the trigger. Martinez was beside him, Garand at the ready. They approached from opposite sides, professional and coordinated, clearing the position with the ruthless efficiency of veterans who'd done this before. The bunker's interior was carnage. 3 Germans, 2 dead from the grenade, 1 badly wounded and clutching his stomach where shrapnel had opened him up. The MG-42 sat silent, its barrel still hot enough that Sylvester could feel it from feet away. Ammunition belts lay scattered like metal snakes. The wounded German looked up at them, his face gray with shock and pain. Young, maybe 20. Sylvester felt nothing except the cold certainty of what had to happen next. This was war. This was the thing they'd all signed up for without really understanding what it meant. Martinez shot him. Clean, professional. No malice, just the ending of a threat. The German died quickly, which was mercy of a sort. Kowalski stumbled up behind them, his face white, eyes wide at the scene inside the bunker. First time seeing death up close, Sylvester realized. The kid looked like he might vomit. "Secure that weapon," Sylvester ordered, pointing at the MG-42. "Johnson, get up here with that BAR. We're setting up a defensive position." Because the war wasn't over. Company B was still advancing, still taking fire from other positions. The 1st Battalion was grinding forward yard by yard, paying the butcher's bill that breaking the German cordon demanded. Behind them, more units were flooding through the breach. The 45th Division on the left, the 1st Armored Division's tanks pushing for the highway. Sylvester looked back across the ground they'd crossed. Bodies lay scattered across the flat landscape, some moving, most not. Medics were working under fire, dragging wounded to collection points. A disabled tank burned, sending up a pillar of black smoke. The price of 200 yards was written in blood and ruin. But they'd taken the position. They'd broken through the first line. And somewhere ahead, past the smoke and fire, lay Cisterna and the road to Rome, and the end of 4 months in hell. Sylvester checked his Thompson, ejected the spent magazine, slammed home a fresh one. "Martinez, get a count. Who's still standing?" The answer, when it came, was sobering. 7 men from the original 12. But 7 was enough. 7 could still fight. "All right," Sylvester said. "Catch your breath. Check your ammunition. Next position's 100 yards ahead and they know we're coming." No one complained. They were alive, and on Anzio, that counted for everything. The 24th of May dawned hot and merciless. The sun climbing into a cloudless sky that offered no shelter, no respite. Sylvester had spent the night in a commandeered German foxhole, watching the eastern horizon and listening to the sounds of sporadic fighting as other elements of the 3rd Division consolidated their gains. Company B had lost 19 men on the first day, 5 dead, 14 wounded badly enough to require evacuation. The mathematics were brutal but familiar. This was the 2nd day of the breakout, and the Germans weren't running. They were fighting for every yard. By 0800, the company was on the move again, pushing deeper into the German defensive belt. The landscape remained stubbornly flat, offering little more than shell craters and the occasional irrigation ditch for cover. The armor had bypassed Cisterna during the night. 1st Armored Division's Shermans had crossed Highway 7 by noon on the 23rd, cutting one of the German 10th Army's main retreat routes. But the infantry still had to clear the strong points, still had to dig the Germans out of positions they'd spent months fortifying. Intelligence estimated 4 battalions holding the forward positions, 3 more in reserve. The 955 Regiment of the 362 Division mostly, with elements of the 715 Division supporting. Good troops, not the elite Panzer Grenadiers or paratroopers, but solid professional soldiers who understood their business and weren't inclined to surrender just because the Americans had artillery superiority. Sylvester's squad, now down to 7 men after yesterday's bloodletting, advanced as part of 1st Platoon's center element. Lieutenant Morrison had been evacuated with his leg wound, replaced by a lieutenant from battalion whose name Sylvester hadn't caught and didn't particularly care about. Officers came and went. Sergeants kept the machine running. The new objective was a series of German positions roughly 200 yards ahead, built around what looked like a farmhouse or storage building. Smoke still hung in the air from the morning's artillery preparation. But Sylvester had been in enough fights to know that artillery could suppress but rarely kill dug-in infantry. Somewhere in those positions, German machine gun crews were waiting with their MG-42s, waiting for the Americans to come into range. 1st Platoon, we're moving in 5. The new lieutenant's voice cracked slightly on the last word. Green. Probably his first real action. Sylvester felt a surge of weary irritation. Yesterday's lieutenant had at least earned his stripes in combat before getting shot. This one looked like he'd been rushed through OCS and shipped overseas before he'd learned which end of the rifle the bullets came out of. But orders were orders. Sylvester checked his Thompson, loaded magazine, round in the chamber, safety off, and gave his squad the signal. They rose as one and began moving forward in a staggered line, using whatever cover the broken ground offered. They'd covered maybe 30 yards when the first machine gun opened up. The sound was immediate and terrifying, that distinctive ripping canvas noise of the MG-42 cycling at 1,200 rounds per minute. The gun was positioned somewhere ahead and slightly right, its field of fire carefully calculated to catch anyone advancing across the open ground, dirt geysered where bullets impacted, stitching a pattern of death across the earth. Sylvester dove for a shallow depression, felt Martinez hit the ground beside him. The bar opened up from their left, Johnson laying down suppressing fire even as tracer rounds sought him out. Good man. Knew his business. 2nd squad, bound forward. 1st squad, suppress. The new lieutenant was trying to maneuver by the book, but the book didn't account for the reality that both squads were pinned down by interlocking machine gun fire. A 2nd MG-42 had joined the 1st, creating a deadly crossfire that covered the approaches to the German position. Sylvester risked a look over the lip of his cover. The Germans had built well. A concrete pillbox or reinforced bunker, probably supported by rifle pits and fighting positions on the flanks. The kind of defensive arrangement that could hold up a company if the attackers weren't careful or lucky or both. Sarge, we can't stay here. Kowalski's voice was tight with fear, but not panic. The kid had learned something yesterday, earned the right to speak up when he saw the tactical situation going bad. He was right. Pinned in the open, Company B would get chewed up by the machine guns and then hammered by mortars once the Germans got the range. They had to move, forward or back, but movement meant exposure, and exposure meant casualties. The decision crystallized in Sylvester's mind with terrible clarity. Someone had to break the stalemate. Someone had to close with that position and neutralize it. Take the Germans' attention off the rest of the company long enough for others to maneuver. That was a squad leader's job. That was what the stripes on his sleeve meant. He turned to Martinez. When I move, You get the squad into that crater at 10 o'clock, 30 yards. Understand? The corporal's eyes widened. Sarge, that's... Just do it. Sylvester cut him off, not unkindly, but with finality. There wasn't time for debate, wasn't time for alternatives. The tactical geometry was simple and brutal. One man charging would draw fire away from 7 men maneuvering. The math was cold, but sound. He checked the Thompson one more time, felt the weight of 3 spare magazines in his pouches. 90 rounds plus the 30 already loaded. Either enough or not, but all he had. Then, before the fear could take hold and freeze him, before rational thought could assert itself and point out the insanity of what he was about to do, Sylvester pushed to his feet and ran. The German machine guns shifted fire immediately, their crews reacting to the new threat with professional speed. Sylvester heard the bullets before he felt them, a sound like hornets mixed with the crack of near misses. He was 30 yards in front of his squad now, fully exposed on the flat coverless terrain, charging head-on toward a position 200 yards distant. The first bullet hit him in the left shoulder. The impact spun him halfway around, pain blooming white-hot and immediate. His left arm went numb, the Thompson nearly slipping from his grasp. He caught it with his right hand, squeezed the grip hard to confirm he still had control, kept running. Blood soaked into his uniform, warm and sticky. Behind him, he could hear Martinez shouting, could hear the squad breaking cover and moving while the German guns were focused on him. Good. The plan was working. All he had to do was keep running, keep drawing fire, stay alive long enough for his men to get into position. 170 yards to the German position. The ground seemed to stretch endlessly, each stride a tremendous effort. The MG-42's fire was a steady stream now, the gunners confident they had him, pouring rounds at a target that couldn't dodge, couldn't hide. The second burst caught him low, bullets impacting his legs and side. Sylvester went down hard, tasting dirt and blood. The pain was beyond anything he'd experienced before, beyond Sicily or Salerno or any of the minor wounds that hadn't seemed to count at the time. This was different. This was bones breaking, flesh tearing, life bleeding out onto Italian soil. But his men were still moving. Through the haze of pain, he could see Martinez leading the survivors toward cover. See Johnson setting up the BAR to provide supporting fire. The Germans were still focused on him, still pouring fire into the man who'd had the audacity to charge their position alone. Sylvester forced himself to his feet. His right arm still worked. The Thompson was still in his hand. His legs screamed protest, but they moved, carrying him forward in a shambling run that was more falling than running. 150 yards now. Blood ran into his eyes from a scalp wound he didn't remember taking. The third burst shattered his right arm. The bones simply came apart under the impact of multiple rounds, reduced from functional limb to bag of broken fragments held together by meat and skin. The Thompson tumbled from nerveless fingers. Sylvester fell again, harder this time, the world tilting sideways as shock tried to drag him down into darkness. 10 stunned Germans were staring at him from the bunker's firing slit. He could see their faces, could read the mixture of horror and disbelief as they watched a man who should be dead 3 times over struggling to rise for a 4th time. They'd thrown everything at him, probably 300 rounds at least, and he was still coming. The rage that flooded through Sylvester then wasn't the hot fury of battle, but something colder, harder, more absolute. These men were trying to kill his squad, his responsibility, his people. And he was still standing, still capable of fighting, still possessed of enough hate and determination to make them pay for every American they'd killed today. His right arm was useless, the shattered bones grinding against each other with every movement. but his left arm still had some strength, and the Thompson lay just feet away. Sylvester crawled forward, grabbed the submachine gun with his left hand, and wedged it under his left armpit in an awkward approximation of a firing position. 70 yards to the German position. He could make it. Had to make it. The squad needed him to make it. He struggled upright one more time, swaying like a drunk. The Thompson clamped under his armpit and braced against his ribs. His vision was tunneling, the edges going gray. But the bunker was directly ahead, and that was all that mattered. Blood ran down his body in streams, pooling in his boots, leaving a trail behind him that marked his passage like breadcrumbs in a nightmare forest. 60 yards. The Germans were screaming now, their voices high and panicked as they poured fire at a target that refused to die. But their aim was wavering, shaken by the impossibility of what they were witnessing. Men didn't do this. Men didn't take 3 killing bursts and keep advancing. This wasn't human. This was something else, something beyond their training or experience. 50 yards. Sylvester pulled the trigger. The Thompson bucked savagely under his armpit, the recoil nearly knocking him down, but he held on through sheer stubbornness. The burst went wild, nowhere near the target. But it didn't matter. The psychological effect was everything. He was shooting back. The monster they couldn't kill was shooting back. 40 yards. His legs were failing, each step requiring concentrated effort. Blood loss was dragging him down, making the world swim and pulse with his heartbeat. But the bunker was close now. Close enough that even wildfire might find the aperture, close enough that the Germans could see his face, see the determination that transcended flesh and bone. 30 yards. Another burst from the Thompson, slightly better aimed this time. One round must have come close because a German ducked back from the firing slit, breaking the MG-42's rhythm. 20 yards. The German crew was breaking. Sylvester could sense it. They'd been fighting for their lives against an unstoppable advance, and now something from their nightmares was closing on their position with murder in its eyes. 15 yards. Close enough. Sylvester triggered the Thompson again, holding the trigger down, emptying what remained of the magazine in one long, ragged burst. The range was point-blank now, close enough that even one-armed fire from a dying man could be effective. He saw 2 Germans fall, saw others scrambling back from the firing slit. Then he heard the sweetest sound of the war. "Kamerad! Kamerad!" 10 Germans emerged from the bunker with their hands raised, their faces gray with shock and terror, surrendering to a man who looked like death incarnate. Blood-soaked, broken-armed, still standing through sheer force of will. Sylvester tried to speak, to order them to drop their weapons and move clear of the position. But his voice wouldn't work. The adrenaline that had carried him this far was burning out, leaving only pain and weakness and the creeping cold of shock. He saw Martinez sprinting toward him, saw Johnson and Kowalski and the others following, saw the captured German position and the path it opened for Company B to advance, saw that his squad, his people, were alive because he'd drawn the fire, taken the bullets, paid the price. The mission was accomplished. The first position was neutralized. But there was another strong point 100 yards ahead, and the Germans there were preparing to fight. Sylvester could see them moving, setting up fields of fire, waiting for the next American assault. His men were pleading with him to lie down, to wait for the medics, to let someone else take over. But Sylvester looked at that second position and understood with terrible clarity that momentum was everything. If they waited, the Germans would be ready. If they hesitated, more Americans would die. Reorganize the squad, he heard himself say, the words coming from somewhere beyond pain or fear. We're moving on that next position. Martinez was staring at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Maybe sanity was a luxury you couldn't afford when men were dying. But the war wasn't over. The mission wasn't complete. And Sylvester Antolak still had one more fight left in him. The world had contracted to a tunnel of pain and purpose. Sylvester stood amid the captured German position, his broken body held upright by will alone, and stared at the second strong point 100 yards distant. The numbers were simple. 100 yards. 91 meters. The distance between here and the next objective. Between mission incomplete and mission accomplished. Between leaving his men vulnerable and clearing the path for Company B's advance. Martinez was beside him, hands hovering as if afraid to touch the ruin Sylvester had become. "Sarge, you need a medic. I need you to listen." Sylvester's voice was steady despite everything. Despite the blood soaking through his uniform, despite the shattered arm hanging useless at his side, despite the shoulder wound that sent fresh waves of agony with each breath. "Get the squad reorganized. Check ammunition. We're moving in 2 minutes." "You can't," Kowalski started, his young face stricken. "I can, and I will." Sylvester cut him off with the voice he'd used to drill green replacements, the voice that brooked no argument. He bent awkwardly to retrieve a fresh magazine from a fallen German, couldn't manage it one-handed. Martinez moved to help without being asked, sliding the magazine into Sylvester's remaining good hand. The Thompson was still there, still functional despite being dropped twice. Sylvester looked at his shattered right arm, at the compound fracture where bone protruded through torn flesh, and made a calculation. The arm was gone, effectively. Whether the surgeons could save it later was a problem for later. Right now it was dead weight and screaming agony. He wedged the Thompson under his left armpit, clamping it against his ribs with his elbow. The position was awkward, the weapon heavy, but he could hold it there. Could trigger it. Could bring fire to bear even if accuracy would be minimal. At close range, minimal might be enough. "Sarge." Johnson had moved up, the big bar cradled in his arms. The automatic rifleman's face was pale beneath the grime and powder burns. "We can handle this. You've done enough." Enough. The word echoed strangely. Was there such a thing as enough in war? Enough dead friends? Enough blood spilled? Enough ground taken? Sylvester had been fighting since Sicily, had seen men do impossible things and die for inches of worthless dirt. Enough was a luxury for peacetime, for people who didn't understand that each yard left unconquered was a yard where Germans could kill more Americans tomorrow. "Form up," he said simply. Not an explanation, not a justification, an order. They obeyed because that's what soldiers did, even when the orders made no sense, even when their sergeant looked like a walking corpse held together by rage and determination. 7 men checking weapons, redistributing ammunition from the dead, preparing to assault a position that would already be alerted, already prepared. The second German strongpoint was built around what might have once been a storage shed, now reinforced with sandbags and earth. Sylvester could see the firing slits, could imagine the machine gun crews inside watching first platoons advance, calculating ranges, preparing fields of fire. They'd witnessed what had happened to the first position. They knew the Americans were coming. They'd be ready. Good. Let them be ready. Let them see what was coming for them. "Martinez, you're acting squad leader. Take the men around the left flank. When you hear my Thompson, you assault. Understand?" The corporal's eyes went wide. "You're going alone?" "I'm the distraction." Sylvester felt something that might have been a smile pulling at his face. "They'll be watching me. That's when you hit them." It was the same tactic that had worked on the first position, the same cold mathematics of drawing fire to create an opening. Except this time, Sylvester was already a dead man walking, already operating on borrowed time. The blood loss alone should have killed him. The shock should have dropped him unconscious. But neither had happened yet. And while he could still move, still fight, he would use what remained. "Sarge." Multiple voices, overlapping protests. "That's an order. Move out." He didn't wait to see if they obeyed, couldn't afford to see the doubt or fear or pity in their eyes. Instead, Sylvester turned toward the second position and began walking. Each step was a negotiation with gravity and consciousness. His legs wanted to buckle, his vision wanted to narrow and darken, his body wanted to surrender to the damage it had sustained. But wanting didn't matter. Only forward motion mattered. Only closing the distance and bringing fire to bear. The Germans saw him almost immediately. How could they not? A blood-soaked American sergeant advancing alone across open ground, weapon wedged under his arm at an impossible angle. Moving with the shambling determination of something beyond human endurance. They must have thought it was a trick, some elaborate feint to cover a flanking maneuver. They were right, of course. But knowing it was a trick and stopping it were different problems entirely. The MG-42 opened up at 70 yards, the bone saw beginning its work. Sylvester kept walking. Bullets impacted around him, close enough to feel the displaced air, close enough to kick up dirt that peppered his face. But none hit. Not yet. Some fragment of luck or divine intervention, keeping him upright as he covered ground that should have been impossible to cross. 60 yards. He triggered the Thompson, a short burst that went wide but served its purpose. The psychological warfare of a man who wouldn't die, who kept coming despite everything. He could hear German voices shouting, could imagine the confusion and fear as trained soldiers tried to process what their eyes were telling them. 50 yards. Another burst from the Thompson. The weapon's recoil nearly toppled him, the awkward one-armed grip providing minimal control. But he stayed upright, stayed moving, stayed focused on the objective. Martinez and the squad were moving on the left flank, using the distraction Sylvester provided to close the distance. Good men. They'd finish this, even if he didn't. The mission would be accomplished regardless. 40 yards. The German fire was intensifying now, multiple weapons converging on his position. They'd overcome their initial shock, were adjusting to the reality that he was mortal, could be killed, must be stopped. Bullets cracked past. Closer now, the gunners finding their range and rhythm. 30 yards. Sylvester felt something impact his left side. A hammer blow that stole his breath. Another wound, another injury to add to the catalog. But his leg still worked. The Thompson was still clamped under his arm. He could still fight. 25 yards. The world was going gray at the edges, reality becoming uncertain. Was he still walking, or had he fallen? Was the ground level or tilting? The question seemed academic, distant, less important than the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. 20 yards. A final burst from the Thompson, the magazine emptying in a ragged stutter. At this range, even one-armed fire was dangerous, rounds impacting near the German position, forcing heads down, disrupting their aim. Then the magazine was empty, and Sylvester had no way to reload, no functioning arm to manipulate the weapon. He let the Thompson fall, heard it clatter against the dirt with strange clarity. No matter. He'd done what was needed. Martinez and the squad were close now, close enough to make their assault. 15 yards from the German position, Sylvester's legs finally gave out. Not a conscious decision to fall, but a simple mechanical failure. The muscles no longer responding to his will. He went down hard, tasted blood and dirt, felt the warm wetness spreading beneath him as his life leaked out onto Italian soil. But he could still see. Could still watch as Martinez led the assault, the squad storming the German position with the fury of men who'd watched their sergeant sacrifice everything to give them this chance. Could hear the grenades detonating, the sharp crack of rifle fire, the shouted commands in English and the panicked responses in German. The firing stopped. The second position was taken. Sylvester tried to smile, managed something that felt like it might be. The mission was accomplished. Company B could advance. The path to Cisterna was open. 20 Germans eliminated between both positions, 1 machine gun captured, the way forward cleared. He heard Martinez running toward him, heard the corporal's voice calling for a medic. But the words seemed to come from very far away. The gray at the edges of his vision was closing in, narrowing the world to a pinpoint of light. Kowalski's face appeared above him, the kid's eyes wet with tears. "Sarge, stay with us. Medic's coming. Just stay with us." Sylvester wanted to tell him it was all right, that this was how it was supposed to end, that every man who put on the uniform accepted this possibility. Wanted to say that dying so his men could live was the best trade he could imagine. The only trade worth making. But the words wouldn't come. His voice lost somewhere in the fading light. Johnson was there too, and Martinez and the others. His squad, his responsibility, his people. All alive because he'd drawn the fire, taken the bullets, paid the price in blood and bone. Worth it, he thought as the darkness closed in. All of it worth it. The last thing Sylvester Antolak saw before the world went black was the squad moving forward, advancing past his position toward objectives unknown. Still fighting, still alive. Mission accomplished. They found him 75 yards from the second German position, fallen forward with his face toward the enemy, the ground beneath him dark with blood. Martinez reached him first, dropped to his knees beside the body of the man who'd led them through Sicily and Salerno and 4 months of hell on the Anzio beachhead. Sergeant Sylvester Antolak was 37 years old. He'd been in the Army since 1941, had earned his stripes through competence and courage, and the kind of steady leadership that kept men alive in impossible situations. He'd charged 200 yards across open ground, been shot 3 times, had his arm shattered, and kept advancing until he'd cleared the path for his company. Now he was gone. The squad stood in silence around their sergeant's body. These men who'd followed him into the fire because he'd never asked them to go anywhere he wouldn't lead. Kowalski was crying openly, not ashamed of the tears that cut tracks through the powder burns and grime on his young face. Johnson held his BAR at port arms like an honor guard, his jaw clenched tight against emotion. Martinez closed Sylvester's eyes with gentle fingers, a final courtesy for a man who died so they could live. Half mad with rage. Someone would write later, trying to capture what happened next. How the squad had stormed the second position with a fury that went beyond training or tactics, beyond the calculated violence of professional soldiers. They'd watched their sergeant sacrifice everything, and they'd made the Germans pay for it in full measure. The 10 surrendering enemy soldiers had been shaking, gray-faced with shock at what they'd witnessed. A man who refused to die, who kept coming despite wounds that should have killed him 3 times over. The medics came eventually, moving through the captured positions to triage the wounded and tag the dead. They looked at Sylvester's body, at the multiple gunshot wounds and the shattered arm and the blood that had soaked into Italian soil, and shook their heads in quiet wonder. That he'd made it as far as he had was impossible. That he'd cleared 2 positions in that condition was beyond comprehension. "Get him back to the aid station," Martinez ordered, his voice rough. "Treat him right." They did. Whatever else could be said about the war, the dead were handled with dignity when time and circumstances allowed. Sylvester Antolak would be buried with full honors in the Sicily-Rome American Cemetery, one of 11,000 Americans who'd fallen liberating Italy, his grave marked with a white cross that would stand among countless others in perfect ordered rows. Company B advanced through the positions Sylvester had cleared, pushing deeper into the German defensive belt. The momentum he'd helped create carried them forward, past the strong points, past the wire and mines, into the broken remnants of German defenses that were finally irreversibly collapsing under the weight of American firepower and determination. By late afternoon on the 25th of May, Cisterna di Littoria fell to the 3rd Infantry Division. The town that had swallowed Darby's Rangers in January, that had become a symbol of the beachhead's futility, was finally in American hands. 4 months of siege warfare ended not with a whimper, but with the thunder of artillery and the grinding advance of infantry who'd paid for every yard in blood. The breakout continued. 1st Armored Division's tanks had cut Highway 7, severing one of the German 10th Army's main retreat routes. The Alban Hills beckoned. Beyond them, Rome, the first Axis capital destined to fall, the prize that had seemed impossibly distant during the dark months of winter and spring. But the price was written in the casualty lists that accumulated with brutal arithmetic. Company B had lost 32 men in 2 days of fighting, 8 dead, 24 wounded badly enough to require evacuation. 1st Battalion's losses were worse, whole platoons reduced to squad strength. Across the entire 6th Corps, more than 4,000 men had fallen in 5 days of combat, adding to the thousands already lost since January. The 3rd Division alone had bled 11,000 men since landing at Anzio, a number that exceeded the division's authorized strength, sustained only by a constant stream of replacements who arrived green and learned fast or died faster. 955 more casualties were added in Operation Buffalo's first week, names and serial numbers that would be recorded in official reports and telegrams sent to families who would never fully understand what their sons and husbands and brothers had endured. Among them, Sergeant Sylvester Antolak, ASN 35035-020, who'd been directly responsible for eliminating 20 Germans, capturing an enemy machine gun, and clearing the path for his company's advance. The official recognition would come later, much later. On the 19th of October, 1945, 5 months after Germany's surrender, General Order No. 89 would announce the Medal of Honor awarded posthumously to Sergeant Antolak. The citation would use words like conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action above and beyond the call of duty. Formal language that tried and failed to capture the reality of what had happened on that flat Italian field under a merciless sun. The citation would note that he'd charged 200 yards over coverless terrain, that he'd been struck 3 times and continued advancing, that he'd killed 2 Germans and forced 10 to surrender at the first position before refusing medical attention and leading the assault on the second strong point. It would record that he'd advanced nearly 3/4 of the distance to that second position before being killed, that his example had inspired his squad to overwhelm the enemy troops. What it couldn't capture was the weight of leadership that had driven him forward, the responsibility he'd felt for the men under his command, the calculation, cold and terrible and absolutely correct, that one man drawing fire could save 7. The supreme sacrifice made not for glory or recognition, but for the simple reason that it was necessary, and he was capable of making it. Audie Murphy witnessed it all from his position with another platoon. Years later, writing his memoir, To Hell and Back, He would tell Sylvester's story under the pseudonym Lutzky, perhaps to protect the family's privacy, perhaps for reasons known only to himself. But the account was accurate, vivid, haunting in its detail. Murphy described watching the sergeant rise and charge, being knocked down and rising again, advancing with a shattered arm while German machine guns concentrated everything on stopping him. Described the fascination and horror of witnessing something beyond normal human endurance. Described how the sergeant's squad, inspired by his valor and half insane with rage, had stormed the German positions and taken them. And Murphy ended his account with words that would echo across decades. This was how Lutzky, the sergeant, helped buy the freedom that we cherish and abuse. Freedom. The word seemed almost abstract here amid the carnage and exhaustion, in this shattered landscape where men had killed and died for yards of worthless ground. But it wasn't abstract. It was concrete, tangible, purchased with blood and bone and the lives of men like Sylvester Antolak. The squad rested that night in captured German positions, too exhausted to feel triumph, too numb to process loss. Martinez sat with his back against a sandbagged wall, Sylvester's dog tags in his hands. He'd removed them before the medics took the body, would make sure they reached the proper authorities. Kowalski stared at nothing, processing his first real taste of war's cost. Johnson cleaned his BAR with mechanical precision, hands moving through familiar motions while his mind tried to reconcile what he'd witnessed. They didn't talk much. What was there to say? Their sergeant was dead. They were alive. The mission was accomplished. Tomorrow they'd advance again, toward Rome and whatever came after, carrying the weight of what they'd seen and what they'd lost. On the 4th of June, 1944, 11 days after Sylvester Antolak fell, Allied forces entered Rome, the first Axis capital to be liberated, taken not by direct assault but by the grinding attrition of men who'd fought their way up from Sicily through Salerno and Anzio, paying the butcher's bill in installments of blood. 2 days later, Operation Overlord commenced in Normandy. The invasion of France that would break Nazi Germany's back, made possible in part by the Italian campaign that had drawn away reserves, that had bled the Wehrmacht in mountains and marshes and beachheads like Anzio. Sergeant Sylvester Antolak never saw Rome, never knew that the beachhead he'd helped break would lead to liberation and victory. Never learned that his name would be attached to a Navy transport ship, to a highway in Ohio, to the first episode of a documentary series that would tell his story to generations who'd never known war. What he knew, in those final moments before darkness took him, was that his squad was advancing, that the path was clear, that he'd done his duty. In the end, perhaps that was enough.